what we heard this morning about how about you have an earthquake and a hurricane. So sometimes the dimensions of your profiles of your hazards also are fluid, and so we need to be able to make that possible to know. And so our tool is looking at adding that level of agility.
Anyone else want to comment on that?
So I would just say that our tools are used regionally primarily because the data and the accuracy, let's not forget the accuracy and reliability of climate information and downscaling beyond the regional scale. And so our presence is done regionally through the National Climate Assessment. The national assessment was done, as I said, topically, but also regionally. Additionally, we have regional climate centers, as I mentioned. The one at Cornell University is taking all of the information and tailoring it and packaging it for beyond state borders, but across their region, which is West Virginia to Ohio and up to Maine. We have 6 of those across the country, so it's not just in the Northeast. But additionally, we have the regional impact sciences and assessments programs that are part of gathering that information and then making sure that it goes out to the local communities and that they think across broad geographies. They think watershed scale primarily and across multiple states. So those are ways that you can reach a local person to look at tools and information for your community.
I would just add, in the spirit of the responses already given, one of the things that we're very aware of and sensitive to at EPA, again, is the importance of dialogues with in this case, regional collaborative organizations. For example, the Mississippi mayors of communities all along the Mississippi recognize that the impacts of climate change to their community and the ways in which they respond and adapt can affect communities upstream or downstream from them. So they've gotten together and they have a great collaborative effort to try to figure out collectively as a region, if you will, or it's actually cross regions, how they can best work together to implement the most effective strategies. For us, that means that, again, working through our regional offices, people like Joe Siegel in Region 2, working through our regional offices, we engage with those collaboratives and we share with them what tools are available from EPA for them to use, but again, being responsive and listening to the dialogue between those mayors and what their needs are.
So I'm gonna, if you have questions, come to the mic. I'm going to ask one more quick question before we get to go into this. We heard a lot about empowering communities and giving them the tools necessary. How do we make sure these tools are informative but not prescriptive for the individuals? I'll look at that same one. Yeah, Joel.
I guess I would use the example of the ArcX to respond to that. As we lead the user, the local government official, by that thread, first helping them understand why they might care about climate change for the services that they're trying to provide to their communities, but then to potential adaptation strategies. We don't tell them, here is the best strategy for you to use. We inform them about the availability of the tool, what the tool can do, and how to use it. But again, at the end of the day, it's up to them to decide whether or not they actually want to use that tool or use a particular approach to adapting to climate change. So it comes back to helping them make more informed decisions, but not prescribing for them what they have to do. And again, at the end of the day, they know better than anybody what will actually work in their communities, given that they're dealing with a lot of other social choices, like feeding their people and so on, and they've got scarce resources to do that.
So I would say, I would concur wholeheartedly that it's the choice of the locals. And as you're doing it, why are you using the tool in the first place? No tool should be prescriptive. It just provides information, and it's, what's the goal of the tool? So I think Dan Carter said in the prior session, if he had to do, what could he focus on if he would have changed something? He said, pre-disaster mitigation. And really, that's where the federal government is going. So right now, we offer a lot of money to states and localities after the disaster But with BRIC and the new legislation, the focus is really on pre-disaster mitigation, and it's going to be competitive. So you're not going to get a certain chunk of money anymore. Now you have to compete for money, and in order to compete well, you are going to have prioritized information that shows how well that project is going to reduce risk. And that comes down to using the tool, but selecting the information that you want that tells the message that you're trying to pass.
And I'll add to that too. So, I'm with the university, and I think I can get away much more than a government can with actually telling the community what they need to do. So I think that there's a nice balance that we can offer, because there are plenty of communities in the state of Indiana. There are only 4 communities in Indiana, going on 5, that actually have a staff person that works on sustainability or climate change. And so all the rest of them need to understand how climate change is going to impact their daily work. And so I think, as Joel was saying, if we connect that to how it's going to impact the daily services that they offer, then we can get them involved in the work without having to say, oh, you need to hire somebody to coordinate all this stuff.
Jennifer's question?
Yeah, so my question sort of actually builds on what you just said. I'm wondering, how do you reach out and engage the local decision makers, and also how do you assess who's using it and how effective it is in order to modify it as needed when you get feedback that this was confusing or this was useful but there's too much of that? Sort of what's your assessment of effectiveness? And actually, that's a question for all of you guys in terms of these wonderful tools, but how do you know they're reaching the right people?
Okay, well, I'll answer that first one. If anybody uses an app on their phone, the person who made the app knows how much time you're spending it on their app. And so that is an important story in our lab. If people aren't using it, it's not a tool. And so we really monitor tightly how much and how often and whether or not the people using the tool are getting what they want out of it. So we do a lot of dialogue. And I think that's really critical, because I like the idea of locals going, what am I supposed to do? This is just a big mess. So trying to figure out what question they're trying to answer, what need they're trying to focus on. And most communities have gone through the goals and they have the targets. And so we have to make these tools synchronize with what it is they're trying to do in a way that it's not an obstacle. And I think that it's almost thinking about let's paint the fence at Tom Sawyer. Have them help us help them, and by making these tools in that collaborative way, I think we're going to get a lot further. So, and even we need a different word than tools.
So I'll just say a big part of NOAA's service delivery model includes the evaluation and assessment of the, as I say, beyond useful and usable into how much the application or tool is actually being used. And further, what are the cost benefits and economic valuation of our tools? And we had a recent study that came back from Charleston, South Carolina, as well as West Palm Beach, Florida, and several other cities in North Carolina, and found that we had a 5-to-1 ratio of benefit to cost in the use of the climate resilience toolkit to make decisions on the local scale. So I would encourage you guys to look at that. It was an interagency site that we supported called toolkit.climate.gov. So let's take a look at that. Oh, one more thing, sorry. In terms of the evaluation, we also have an entire mechanism within a 15,000 person agency to examine the effectiveness of all of our tools, whether it's put out by the Weather Service. Every time you guys see a weather report, we go back and we do an assessment. Every time the Weather Service puts out alerts and watches warnings and forecasts, those forecasts are assessed for their effectiveness. I used to call it the self-licking ice cream cone, because we go back and say whether or not our ice cream was any good. But we then go back and put a little more sugar in it or a little more things. So we do tailor those tools once we hear back from communities about how our tools are used. And that's what helps us improve.
Building off the comments that were just made, and I applaud what NOAA is doing, because that's the right way to do it. Evaluating how effective tools are is a big challenge for us, and I want to be upfront about that. And just to give you a little bit of the history about how we've progressed at EPA, and I'm sure this is true for NOAA, every year we have annual performance measures that we have to report to the Office of Management and Budget about how well our programs are doing. Years ago, when we first started to develop these tools, the performance measures were how many tools have been developed this year. How many training modules have been developed, and so on. That's an important first step, and we hit all of our targets. But then the more important question that we started to ask ourselves about 2 years ago is, what difference are they making? Are people actually using them? Are they actually informing decisions? And that can be a challenging, what are the outcomes, not the outputs? And that can be a challenging thing for us to evaluate because of the Paperwork Reduction Act. If I could do a survey, I could go out to all those mayors and county executives and ask them, how have you actually used them? We can't do that. So we have to do it in a backdoor way that actually mirrors what Ellen just said, working through our regional offices, for example, through our program offices, the people who are actually working with people on the ground. We try to derive the information about the difference that they're actually making. And more importantly, and this gets to the question that was asked, to try to learn what is working and why, and what isn't working and why not. And I got to tell you, finding out something's broken isn't a bad thing if you use that lesson to then turn around and improve what you're trying to do.
Well, this is a question more for FEMA and less about tools perhaps, but how do we infuse adaptation and mitigation with equity when people and communities who have more resources are able to compete in these competitive grant processes and to get funding for rebuilding and recovery efforts, whereas folks who have, who don't have legal housing, who perhaps don't have the paperwork, the documentation that's needed to apply for grants, are not able to get the resources that people who are already well-resourced are able to then, they're able to gain more wealth as already wealthy folks. Whereas like folks who go in the Chief community in Puerto Rico who might have, don't have property deeds, are not able to get the same sort of funding sources.
Yeah, no, it's a challenge because we assume that, everybody comes to the table equally suited because our programs are focused on risk and not on, wealth or any other metric. So it's all about how much risk can we reduce. So we rely on the states to work with us to do that. So we do outreach. Like right now I have a team in New Jersey at the League of Municipalities Conference talking to all 565 mayors down there about this very thing. Same complaints are made about the National Flood Insurance Program that, people with resources can afford the insurance and the ones who don't have the resources can't. Now, it'd be nice if, we can get to the truth of that, because I don't believe it. But, I do believe that people with resources can afford insurance, but I think insurance has to be a priority for everybody to be able to recover. So if you're buying a house, you have to factor in the fact that climate is changing, that, water, every house will get flooded at some point, for the most part, in the Northeast. So you have to be ready to be able to respond to that, and insurance is a big part of that. So I do think that we don't do enough. There's a lot of approaches that are fairly novel. Right in Syracuse, they're offsetting local property tax for homeowners if they buy flood insurance. So that's helping, but it's everybody's in the game together. It's not just how come the federal government's not taking care of the lowest level. Again, each federal agency has a different mission. Ours is to reduce risk and make everybody better prepared to address when the risk does become realized. So I wish there was a way that we can say we'll take care of everybody, but there's a lot of other agencies hopefully that are doing that at the state and local level too.
If I could just add, and this gets back to tools, but it may be helpful. It doesn't get at the question of how the money is spent to help those communities. But those of you who are focused on EJ issues may be familiar with EPA's EJ screen tool. And we are working right now to integrate let me back up, I'm sorry. The EJ screen tool helps EJ communities understand the impact of different environmental stressors on them. For example, how they may be disproportionately affected by bad air quality. We are integrating into the EJ screen right now considerations of climate impacts as well, so that they can also understand what these risks posed by climate change may disproportionately mean for them as opposed to other people in their community. And the example I always use is in 1995 in Chicago, where the elderly in poor neighborhoods who couldn't afford air conditioning and had their windows nailed shut because they were worried about crime, were the ones, 800 of those people died. So that's what we're, again, how we're trying to inform those decisions, and that tool will be available soon.
Yeah. I have three very short questions. One, know everyone who owns a computer, have internet access, or have the updated software to use some of the tools, thinking more in rural America and rural Puerto Rico. Second, when FEMA and EPA comes and reach out to the municipalities regarding information and tools are you reaching out to professional organizations like the Planning Association, Geographers Association, and so. Third, regarding the deployment that FEMA had, you said professionals every 3 or 6 months, and I think that to build relationship, human relationship with people at the municipality or government level needs time. So when you do that deployment of every 3 months or 6 months, the relationship is lost and you have to start from step one. So how you're going to, moving forward, to work with that issue to build that trust and human relationship.
Yeah, I'll take the third, that we're dealing with. So, biggest challenge in FEMA and in all our disasters is being able to keep a steady team on the ground that can work with that community for not just the first 6 months, but for the 5 or 6 years that it takes. And unfortunately, there's lots of rules. The biggest obstacle for us is IRS rules that don't allow you to be there more than 50 weeks, essentially, is our target. Otherwise, it becomes your residence, and then you get taxed on your living expenses for wherever you're staying, your hotel and your meals and everything else. So we have to cycle people out prior to the 50 weeks. And the biggest complaint we hear from our states is that, we just went through all this legwork to try to put projects together, and then that team moved out, and another team came in, and we're starting over again. And it is a very big challenge. But the disaster, depending on the size of the disaster, requires a surge workforce from other areas. And they come in from all over the country, they come in from other agencies. We have people from the EPA and different agencies that come in during big disasters to help support, don't have that same level of knowledge of the programs, and certainly they're coming in from different parts of the country. They're not planning to come there for 5 or 6 years. There's no easy solution. We try to keep the regional team engaged who do live there so that we have some continuity, but you can't do it in every single circumstance.
I'll add to that too, so I think this is an opportunity for universities, because universities are there, and we do have knowledge experts, and so I think, in Indiana, we tell folks there are certainly parts of Indiana that don't have very good internet access, and so we tell them, here's our phone number, call us, if you want us to come visit, we will, because that's what we're here for, and so we try to make that as open and accessible as possible.
And another thing that's possible to do when you use this incredible amount of data and lots of analytics is we hope to get to the insight so that we can recognize these are particular issues with this situation and have narrative solutions. So everything doesn't have to be a heavy data crunch. We have to do that to begin with so we don't make mistakes, but once we've done that, in New York it's going to be, we have a large variety of sizes and shapes heavy urban, we got rural, we probably got a piece of almost every place in the world. We have examples of it. So looking at all those different places, there are probably going to be solutions that we'll find that can be narratively shared, and to be able to get information back from your community. Did it work, or is there something else that needs to be done? So I think the dialogue with the universities is really a great way to go.
And if I can respond to your question about working with planning organizations, our colleague Janet McCabe, who works with Andrea from Indiana University, in her presentation yesterday said, let's not reinvent the wheel. We're more than, we, meaning Indiana University, is more than happy to share the wheels that they've already invented. And the same thing goes true for planning organizations and even governmental organizations like the Conference of Mayors, the National League of Cities, and the National Governors Association. We recognize that, as you put it, the dissemination of the tools, not just making people aware that they're out there, but actually getting it into the hands of the right people is critically important. We just can't throw it over the transom. We can't just put it on the website and assume they'll know that it's there. So we, in the spirit of not reinventing the wheel, we are working with organizations like that and partnering with them to ensure that these tools and resources are disseminated to their cohorts, so the people who are relevant to that planning organization.
I'll just add the same thing, that we've been part of the American Planning Association for years. It's one of our biggest meetings that we go to with the NOAA booth. So we're involved in a lot of the planning associations. I again come back to the local relationship though, especially for the environmental justice communities or underserved communities. The Gullah Geechee are part of our work in terms of, especially their presence in South Carolina. They're part of our drought mitigation efforts. It's also, I think about some of the EJ communities that I work with around my region, which is Florida to Maine, and almost all the time it's because they're partnering with some of the folks that already do have those capabilities. So, you know, be the voice that can go to the folks that have that capability and say, can we be included? NOAA puts out our data calls and our requests for proposals with words in there like regional. And if you are in a region, you partner arm in arm with the folks like Seagren and others that have those capabilities, and you say, let's go together and build this so that you are part of the solution and you have a part in the fight. So, yeah, so in terms of owning computers, it is the phone call. It's the phone call to the folks that are already there. Pick up the phone, walk on over. They have a local presence, and they should be taken advantage of in that way.
One last quick question.
So I have two questions. So the first one is, what are specific stakeholders that your tools target for? And then my second question is specific for Dr. Lawson. So have you think about linking your tool to the local comprehensive planning maintenance?
Okay, the answer to the last one is absolutely yes. I was a professional land use planner for the city of Portland, Oregon, and that's my secret mission, is to make sure that all of these tools do connect up with the existing planning, zoning, and comprehensive planning. So I think that's really critically important. I think that overall, the target for us right now is to make sure that we have FEMA-approved local plans that meet the needs of the FEMA evaluators, because there are specific things that they need to do, but at the same time provide this broad understanding of what's happening in communities, because there are lots of decisions. I'm really impressed with what I read yesterday. FEMA pushed out the Lifeline documents. I recommend everybody look at them. It's the first thing we got to think about, is how do you get where you need to go when the first minute happens, so that you can actually get to recovery. And so I think keeping our communities in the information base without making it burdensome, so that we can share with them how other places are learning, but make it possible for them to accomplish what they need to do and be ready for the next time they need to do it. And the final evaluation will be, so you had that flood last week, how are things now? I'm really anxious to make sure that we get to that question. Often in planning and research, we make something, we do something, we never find out if it works. I think for the first time we have to be really cognizant. Did it work? If it didn't work, what are we going to do different? because we can't keep making the same mistakes, and unfortunately, we're kind of guilty of that right now.
So I don't want to stand in front of you guys on lunch. I know it's back there and it's time for lunch. I'm sure the panelists are happy to stick around for a little bit to answer any additional questions, but I just want to thank them one more time before we go.
And there are papers available here for anybody who would like.